Hi, Destiny. Welcome to the Autism Little Learners podcast. And I can't tell you how excited I am to have you here.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We did do a little chatting prior to hitting record and had such a great conversation on a lot of different topics related to advocates like you are. So, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yes. So I would say I'm a mental health professional by trade. So I have been in the mental health field for almost 15 years now. And all of my background, I've worked with adults, but my focus came in working with children. So I've been a therapist for children in the juvenile justice system. I've been a therapist for children who have experienced abuse. So I'm also a trauma certified therapist for children. And then I've worked in the early child development center setting as well as the school setting as a mental health professional. And I became an advocate when my oldest child entered into the public school system undiagnosed. I'm a military spouse, and so I knew that I would need to be able to advocate for his education. I always like to point out his teacher was phenomenal. We worked really well together, but our battle was administration. um and then really understanding, because he was so smart and he was so verbal, that there was still something going on there. And so we kind of entered into the school system like, okay, I've worked in this, we got this. We did not have it. And so we finally had to get a clinical psychologist and an educational psychologist involved, um, for a diagnosis. I was just seeking out for therapy, but they did formally evaluate and diagnose him with autism. And then my husband had to go to the superintendent, and that's how we got a special education evaluation done. And so we got him on an IEP. And so I was just, and we involved an advocate at the time as well, just a free advocate through the military side of things. And, just learned so much. And I was like, I had a younger child who has a speech delay. So I knew he'd be on an IEP. So I was like, I need to learn this process. And so that's how I became an advocate and really passionate about supporting families, because my son was actually suspended 3 times in 2 weeks at 6 years old.
Oh my goodness.
Um, and so, excuse me, 5 years old.
Mm.
And so I was just like, this is not right. And then later, after his diagnosis, I was late diagnosed autistic and ADHD, and I sought that diagnosis out, because my son and I are two sides of the same coin. And so, and I had went through what I found out later was a really bad burnout because of the trauma from the schooling situation. And I never experienced that before. And so I was just like, okay, something else is going on here that I'm not quite understanding. And so that's how I got where I am.
Wow. Okay. I did not know the extensive background in so many ways, like with both of your kids, with
Yeah.
your diagnosis, the military piece. Like, I never thought of that with military families moving around so much and going to different schools. A parent kind of has to be educated and an advocate or hire someone to help them out because that's a lot to navigate going to
Yeah.
different schools.
And that's why so we are actually getting ready to move again, June, July timeframe. And so my son will have gone to 3 elementary schools, and he'll only be going to third grade. And so that gives you an idea of, like, when we even talk about an IEP team, I always tell parents, even if you're not military, you are the most consistent member of that IEP team. Every year, you're at that table. Even if you stay in the same district, the directors can leave, the principals can leave, the educators
Mhm.
leave. Then they also change. The related service provider change. You go from elementary to middle school, you're the most consistent member. And so it's important for you to know how to advocate for your child.
Absolutely. And when you're thinking of autistic kids, like the number one hardest time is a transition. And so when they're transitioning more and having to rebuild or build new relationships with new staff,
Mhm.
it's a hard has to be a hard thing to navigate. So you are the one that can help bridge that. I mean, that this could be a whole entire episode in itself, is navigating transitions and advocacy for military families.
Yes. Yes, it could. It's its own unique component that So an organization that I'm a social media manager for and an advocate for is Partners in Promise, and they're a military organization that specifically focuses on special education.
Oh,
And it was started by military spouses with children in special education. And so they do research and, we do advocacy, and I'm one of the advocates again. And it's just so important because one of the things that we see is you have educators saying, I need more education
mhm.
on military families. And then you have military families going, I need educators to understand what we go through with my special education child. So yeah,
Yeah, definitely.
it's a whole thing in itself.
Yeah, definitely unique set of needs and circumstances.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
we did a little sidetrack there, but it's because I
Yeah.
didn't know this about you. This is so interesting. My dad served in Vietnam, and he, is very proud of his military service. So it's, yeah, it's a
And
big
my
thing.
dad served too, and my grandpa served, and
Oh,
my uncles served, and so yeah, and I have aunts that served. It's like all we've been through my family. So
yeah, yeah. Well, when it comes to you and what you're doing with advocating and
mhm.
helping families in the school districts, what would you say? We're talking a little bit more today, focused on accommodations and modifications in IEPs. So, what is an accommodation versus a modification on an IEP? Because I think sometimes they get lumped together, like you can't even say it together.
Absolutely. So I have looked at many definitions, and one of the casual ones that I like for families to really grasp it, and this is how I train on it, is that an accommodation changes how they learn and how they get their work done. So for example, providing them with larger print or
Mm,
speech to text. Um, a modification is changing what's taught or what's expected to be learned. So if they are in third grade, but their curriculum is first grade because that's where
mm, yeah, that makes total sense. And I'm picturing different things that I had in my classroom for 25 years that were an accommodation, like maybe the scissors were a loop scissors that you just have to squeeze, that the OTs introduced us to, would be an accommodation. And a
right,
modification is like changing almost the level of some of those activities. It might be alternative work or
right,
activities. Okay,
right. Yeah,
gotcha.
so when you're looking at, because we know when we talk about IEPs, we're talking about that specifically designed instruction. And
Hmm.
so that's really where you'll see any kind of potential modifications. When we're trying to see, okay, do they need some type of curriculum modification? Do they need a testing modification? You're looking at, are they able to do this same content as their non-disabled peers? If not, how do we need to modify it? And we use that term without realizing modification, but how do we need to modify this so they can access it like their non-disabled peers versus with accommodations? How do we need to accommodate them so they can access this with their non-disabled peers?
Mm, okay. So where would something like sensory tools, fidget toys. I don't like the word toys because it's not really, I mean, it's a tool,
Not
right?
really,
It's
right. It's not
sensory
really a
tools.
toy.
Yeah, I think that fidget toy kind of gives it a connotation like they're just playing with it and it doesn't have a
Right.
serve a purpose. But the sensory tools, where would that fall?
So that would fall in accommodations. So for example, a lot of times our autistic and ADHD individuals have executive functioning
Hmm.
barrier. And so in order to address that, we might let them have a fidget so that they can focus and concentrate better on the task they're completing. So you notice how the task itself isn't changing. So let's
Yeah.
say that they're working on a writing assignment. They're still doing the same writing assignment as their peers. They're just getting to have a fidget in order to help them focus in one hand while they're writing the assignment in the other. So you're just accommodating them so that they can complete the task.
Yeah, that's perfect. At the early childhood level, at our circle time or group time, we had different types of seating. So
Mhm.
some might have a cube chair that kind of snugs them in. Some might have a wiggle cushion that they're sitting on, and then a variety of different sensory tools. And
Yeah,
even some kids would have a mini visual schedule that kind of broke down group time, what was coming. But then that allowed them to participate in the circle time that I was running. Okay.
right.
Perfect. I love giving real life examples like you're giving because it helps everybody that's listening kind of visualize it. Like, okay, that's
Mhm.
what it looks like actually in the classroom. And
Yes.
kind of an extension to that question, what are some examples of neurodiversity affirming accommodations in particular that you might recommend?
Yeah, so just as a recap, I always like to say when we talk about neurodiversity affirming, we're really saying meeting everyone where they're at. And a lot of times individuals think of, for some reason, giving neurodivergent learners this unfair advantage. And it's like, no, when you understand the neurodiversity movement, and that model, it's saying that we just honor that everyone has differences and we support that. So when we talk about those accommodations, we're talking about one that you already mentioned, alternate seating. That's one that I think is so beneficial, especially for our younger learners to really figure out how they best seat
Hmm.
to access the curriculum, right? So alternate seating, because that means that you don't have to sit crisscross applesauce,
Correct.
with your hands in your lap and your eyes on the board, right? Like like that's what, our generations were taught. And it's just
Absolutely.
like I might have been struggling the whole time to make sure, am my legs crossed? Are my hands in my lap? Am I looking at the board? But when I'm doing that, I'm not thinking about anything you're teaching me. Because I'm too focused on making sure I'm following the rules. So,
Yeah.
and that's common for autistic individuals. And so the alternate seating, noise canceling headphones.
Mm.
So when we talk about that overstimulation piece, we know that kindergarten classrooms, preschool classrooms, they can be loud. And so we don't often factor in, like, if I have that much sensory input going on, then maybe I'm really not hearing your directions or your instructions or transitioning well. And then I might find myself when it's quieter, right? Trying to then do the things because I'm like, oh, now it's quieter and I can focus and this is what I want to do.
Hmm.
So noise canceling headphones, honoring all types of communication, so whether they use an AAC device, vocalizations, gestures, whether they're verbal. I actually use a visual when I do my training that you created.
Oh.
When you talk about the different and you talk about the different types of communication, because I like pull visuals from the internet and I actually use a visual that you created that I think was amazing, where you have the different types and then I go into explanation on like what does this mean. Um, Visual schedules, I think that's a pretty common one that gets used a lot. And so I am always happy to see it, but I think it's kind of become a mainstay right now, right? Like everyone's kind of the first thing, visual schedules. So, and then one of the other things, unrestricted access to sensory tools.
Love
And
that.
so that's acknowledging that they may need the tool even when you quote unquote don't think they do. Right? Like they
Yeah.
just don't want to do their work. And it's like maybe they're having a hard time focusing.
Yeah.
Maybe they're overstimulated, maybe they need a comfort item, which is another thing you can use, having access to
Hmm.
a comfort item. So those are some big neuroaffirming ones that I think about when we talk about our littles. And then when they're in like kindergarten, breaking down those bigger assignments into smaller pieces. So just acknowledging that everyone doesn't have the same amount of ability to focus and concentrate for the same amount of time. So someone can do it for 2 minutes, someone can do it for 5 minutes, someone can do it for 10, for 15. And so looking at that, and then I know I said that was the last one, but the last would be incorporating things that they like. So I often say, when you're doing like writing task in kindergarten, a reading task when they're learning to do those things. Even when you're in preschool, like my son, he loves Pokemon. And so they were trying to figure out if he could write, if it was the exhaustion from the writing, what was the barrier. And they gave him a Pokemon story and he wrote it perfectly fine. He wrote everything the way he was supposed to write it. And so we started to incorporate that into his academics.
Okay, Destiny, you are speaking my language now when you talk special interests, because that is
Yes.
my jam. That is how I develop relationships with my students, positive relationships, and get active engagement. And
Yes.
it's funny that you tell that story about the writing in Pokemon, because many years ago, and I've told this story before, but I had twins in my class, autistic, non-speaking, except one of them could sing the entire song Life is a Highway by Rascal Flatts.
Okay.
But like when he had movement, when he was singing, swinging or something.
Okay.
But yeah, it was great. But anyway, they both, um, we worked with OT. We're like, oh, are their fine motor muscles really low tone? Like they don't hold a pencil or a marker. You put it in their hand and it drops to the ground right away. So we're thinking it's a muscle thing.
Mhm.
Well, I was like, gosh, they love country singers so much. So I made, you know how you make your own like worksheets. So I made the dots to make a tracing activity. So I had a picture of like Willie Nelson, and then I dotted out the whole name, Willie Nelson. Now these boys did not show us the ability to write their names. They weren't interested. Like,
Mhm.
why would I want to write my name? The minute Willie Nelson was there, they traced. I'm like, oh.
Wow.
All right. Well, those muscles are doing okay, I think. But it opened up so much for both of them and for us to teach them. So I would teach beginning math skills, like when we're doing give me three, give me two, and I would
Mhm.
just have pictures of Willie Nelson. Give me three Willie Nelsons. I just absolutely love using those passions.
Yes. I mean, you touched on something that's very important though, and like part of working with autistic children, and adolescents, adults, at any age, but really when they're very little, is that buy-in and that interest, right? Like that's why so many shows for littles are so bright and colorful. And this is all research that has shown like they gravitate towards brightness and colors for some, and for others they don't. And every learner's different. And so you touched on something that I think is very important for educators and for parents who are really battling, like, I'm not an educator. I don't know how that works. When your child has an IEP or a 504, making sure that when they're being assessed, it is an accurate assessment of them based on the input you can provide about what you know about them, right? Like if I know my
Mhm.
child loves Pokemon and we're working on math, well, can you count how many Pikachus there are? You know what I mean? And if
Exactly.
he can count how many Pikachus there are, then we don't have a counting problem, right? Like
Totally.
that's
Totally.
yeah, that's clear as day. And so I think, but what you spoke about is something that, I thankfully have had the experience with my children's teachers. Um, is that really getting to know the child and like how do we incorporate this to help them be successful?
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, it's the creative and super fun part, or was for my job for 25 years, is figuring those things out. And a piece of that is really communicating with parents because they know the things. It could
Mhm,
be a certain song like Hickory Dickory Dock by Super Simple Songs
mhm.
on YouTube. It could be something like that that will help you capture their attention too. And it's amazing. Like you said, it's not just about us teaching them new skills, it's us finding out what they already know through this different way. So I had a student a couple years ago where we had the IEP review and we were meeting, and I think the OT and the special ed teacher were like, yeah, he's here once again writing. He's not tracing any of the capital letters yet. And the mom was like, well, he is at home. And, I think the first reaction sometimes for teachers is like, okay, and it's unfortunate, but that's just like, you're
Right,
like, we've
right.
tried
Like
all
you
these
don't
things.
want you don't want us to think your child can't
Yeah.
do,
Like,
or
are
I'll
you
also
sure?
get the other one of well, I have to see it.
Right, right.
Mhm,
So my mind after doing this for so many years was thinking, how is she? I believe her that he's doing it. When you're younger, you might not always believe it, but as you get older, you have seen these kind of discrepancies, like can't
mhm,
do it at school, but does it at home or vice versa. So my mind started to think, okay, we got to figure out how she's presenting it, what words she's using, what is it paper or a whiteboard, that kind of thing. And
mhm.
so we asked her, and I said, can you take a video of yourself doing that with him so we can see? And then I'm like, okay, this kid loves screens. He loves watching songs. I'm just going to show him the video of his mom doing it. And I found out it was a whiteboard. So I had a whiteboard in front of him and marker. He just started doing it right along. So it was video modeling. And
Mm.
boom, yes, he could do all this. It just needed to be transferred, but we needed that common language to transfer it. So even something like video modeling could be written into an IEP. At,
Yes, and that's and I think sometimes too with parents, I always remind them too, like what you're talking about, that is, accommodating the child. And sometimes they get fearful of their child maybe doing too much and like they're gonna take the IEP. And it's like, no, those are things that are accommodations. So those are things that they still need to access the curriculum. That's
yeah,
still how they're learning. That's not, that's a benefit for them to know because then we're not the they're not, I should say, the school is not, misunderstanding your child's intelligibility, which is a lot of
yeah,
what can happen when we are not finding the alternative ways for them to access the curriculum.
yeah. That well said with that. Are there times when something is better listed as an accommodation or modification versus an actual goal on an IEP?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times we have to think of it as goals are something that are supposed to be measurable.
Hmm.
They're supposed to be something that we are working on and then they no longer need. That's the best explanation I like to give of goals. So for example, if they only know so many CBC words and they're trying to get to a certain amount of CBC words, that's a goal. You can measure that, you can break that down, you can see what's being used to help them do that. Same with even social emotional, which I don't see a lot of goals on. That's the first thing I look for in an autistic learner's IEP is do they
Hmm.
have social emotional goals if there's any type of sensory needs or struggles with transitions or any type of referrals or write-ups. Um, you can measure how many emotion words they're learning. You can measure them demonstrating those coping skills that they're learning. You can measure them self-advocating for themselves. When we're talking about accommodations and modifications, again, we're talking about how they're accessing the curriculum, not what they are learning with the curriculum. And so so like when you mentioned the video modeling, that is something that they may need for the entirety of their educational career. So
Hmm.
that's something that doesn't change. It stays in there every time we relook at the IEP, it's still in there, right?
Yeah.
But goals should be changed. Goals should be updated. Goals should not be the same goals year after year after year, because if it is, then maybe they don't have the accommodations or modifications necessary to be successful in the goal, or maybe the goal is no longer, wasn't initially up to their ability to accomplish. And what I mean by that is, I always say, and I've seen this, the child is not writing letters or words, but we're going to have them write 3 sentences by the end of the year.
Mm. Yeah.
Maybe they can, but when that end of the year comes, if they still haven't mastered the letters and words, then what are we doing? That obviously means that that goal is not achievable and it doesn't have those steps. And so then we look at the accommodations and modifications that are being used to help them accomplish that. Do they need an OT tool? Do they need OT services? Right?
Yeah.
Is there a struggle with the letters because they have a speech delay? And so they need speech services. Like we have to look at those things in conjunction with that.
Yeah. I think a challenge with that at the early childhood level is you are getting a lot of kids that are newly diagnosed or newly receiving a special education evaluation, and they're in your classroom or on your caseload, and you don't know kind of what their trajectory is going to be, their pace of learning. And so you might encounter that where you're like, we didn't meet the goal, we kind of overshot, or we always tell parents, okay, this is the goal we're writing, but if he meets that and we're only a month and a half into the school year, we're just going to keep going. Like, we don't have to meet right away to change it.
Right.
If we have conferences coming up, we can actually do it then, but we don't just stop there. We'll keep going. And so I think that's important to kind of talk about with the early childhood level, because sometimes you're starting, you don't know the child yet. You don't have past years teachers kind of writing
Mhm.
down how their progress has evolved over time.
Yeah, and early childhood is really, I would say, you guys are the testers.
Yes, yes,
So you are kind of the base for, okay, they have this, this, and this. I'm noticing this, this, and this. Sometimes early childhood educators are the first structured environment the child has been in.
for sure.
So I think one of the biggest battles that you all have, again, working in that setting as a mental health professional, is that sometimes when trying to talk to the parents are like, well, I've never seen that at home. And it's like a lot of times it's because this may be their first time in a structured setting. Maybe
Hmm.
they don't have any siblings. Maybe their sibling is only a baby, right? So they're introduced to all these things of like, oh, somebody else is in my space and I
Yeah,
to share this toy or and they don't have to share the toy, but when somebody comes and wants the toy and they're like,
yeah,
I'm used to all these things being mine and they're not all mine, or we have lunch at a certain time, I just tell mommy I'm hungry, or I just
yeah,
go to mommy and use whatever type of communication I use.
yes,
Okay, you want to eat, let's do your food, and it's like,
yeah,
have it at this time and we do this. So I think that that's the thing too, is that can be difficult, but also you all being curious, because I just have to believe when you work with that age group, you're curious and that you love
yes,
to learn because,
yes. You
you
have
know,
to be.
but you're curious. And so you do get to see, hey, I noticed that they love to do this. And so when you come into that setting, especially when I see them transition from pre-K to kindergarten, you have this unique ability to say, I noticed this supported them and this supported them, because a lot of times I think it's considered more socially acceptable in pre-K to have
Yeah,
access to all these lovely things. And then when kindergarten comes, it's almost like, well, they're older now. They have to learn. So they, it's like
it's so
it's like they gotta
true.
sit at a desk and they gotta do this. And you're like, well, I noticed for circle time they did really good with the
Yeah,
wobbly cushion,
yeah,
like you're
yeah,
just like, so maybe we could do that. But I think you get this unique perspective, but this difficult one at the same time, because you don't have those things coming in and you kind of have to really work with the parent, excuse me, to figure that
yeah,
out.
yeah. That's a great point with we kind of have a clean slate when it
Mhm,
comes to like what strategies are going to work. But
mhm,
then when they leave us, we will have that idea and that kind of that groundwork laid that
mhm.
is going to help future teachers that the child's going to have. And hopefully have also been able to like communicate with the parents and spend time with them, teaching them about some of the strategies so that they can also communicate that at the next level or wherever they go.
Yes, absolutely.
So, Destiny, what do you do when an accommodation maybe isn't working well and the child is experiencing challenging behavior? So sometimes you may have some accommodations in there that you thought maybe would help with the behavior, but it's not. What would the next step be then?
So the first thing I always say is we have to look at, is it being implemented with fidelity?
Mm,
Um, And
yeah.
one of the ways I look at that is, when we start talking about any type of behavior, I want to know where it's happening, with who it's happening, how often it's happening, and what is happening before, during, and after.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's the mental health professional in me.
Yes.
um, but I think we leave a lot of those pieces out. So, for example, it might only be during specialist time that we're seeing these behaviors. And one of the things that we know when we start talking about IEPs and implementation is that they can be beautifully implemented in the gen ed classroom, the special ed classroom, and the related service provider classroom, right? Because you are all members of the IEP team that come and sit at that table. But
Yeah.
in the special setting, it's like I see every child in this school throughout the course of my week.
Yeah.
And so am I remembering the accommodation? Am I implementing it? So I always go back to that fidelity piece. The next piece is data.
Hmm.
So, recently I was in an IEP meeting and we requested that they have a list of the accommodations given to each of the specialist teachers, just the accommodations, and that they identify which ones they are using before they are reaching out to the parent, communicating any challenging behaviors, because the behaviors are only happening in specials.
Yeah.
And a lot of the behaviors that were occurring, quote unquote, were clearly executive functioning
Yeah.
concerns. And that had to do with the child being ADHD. So
Yeah.
we were like, we do that piece. But when you do all that, sometimes the accommodation is just not working. And the first thing that I always go to um, is looking at, is it, again, we go is looking at all settings. So looking, is it not working in all settings? A lot of times I've noticed we tend to leave out certain providers when we're in meetings. Sometimes we leave out the gen ed teacher. Sometimes we leave out the speech therapist. Like, so that we leave out the input of like what's working in their setting. And what I've learned is, we really need to ask them, because a lot of times I'll see where speech therapists and occupational therapists in particular will identify all these accommodations that they're doing that work when they're doing their service time with the learner. And there
Hmm.
are accommodations that aren't listed in the IEP because they're like, well, I'm using them and nobody else has mentioned to me that they're having these same struggles I'm having. And so we just don't discuss it.
Yeah.
So including all members of the team, asking the parent, depending on the child's age and their ability to communicate that, asking them. I've seen a lot of my autistic learners as they get older able to say like, hey, a graphic organizer doesn't work for me.
Mm.
So, and never assume, and I always say to parents, think about how much you say like, oh, my 3-year-old like communicates all the time, or they're always doing this or doing that. Think of that in the same regard when it comes to these accommodations.
Yeah.
When they're supposed to know, because they're supposed to know what support they're getting. And so even if they're 3, 4, 5, talking to them, and then especially when they start getting 4 or 5, they can say, like, I don't like that. It doesn't work. It doesn't
Mm.
help me. And that's all you need. You don't need them to give some big elaborate, when I am trying to write my letters, this looks like, you don't need
Yeah.
all that.
Yeah.
You just need like, mommy, that thing they put on my pencil doesn't help me.
Yeah. Yeah. Or they keep taking it off and throwing it or whatever.
Right.
Like some of those
Right.
nonverbal cues.
Those nonverbal cues. Like they're like, well, every time that I give them this, they just knock it on the floor. Every time I give them this fidget, they don't use it.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe that's not the fidget for them.
It's not the right fit.
But
I think
that's
I think
We don't
another
do that
important.
though. Oh,
I
sorry. I was
know.
just
I
gonna say
know.
we don't do that though. We don't
Right.
often include the child's input, and we just assume, and I say that around any, not even if they have a disability, we just often, and that's how our generations grew up,
Hmm.
we just assume like we know what's best and
Yeah.
don't like give them the opportunity. It's like, I'm like, it can be as simple as lining up a group of fidgets and
Hmm.
like seeing which one they gravitate towards, letting them
Yeah.
use each one and move it and see how it works for them. And then giving them a task and seeing how it helps them focus. Cause maybe one is good for calming down, but one is good for focus. Like it can be as simple as that.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes when you were talking, it made me think of sometimes we push our own agenda, not
Mhm.
in like a mean way or,
Right.
it's well-meaning.
Mhm.
But sometimes we need to take some of those signals of, if I have a certain, even if it's early childhood and I have a toy and I'm like, oh, this child's going to love this today, and they're pushing it away, that is that multimodal communication. They're saying no. And you might not know why, but that's where you can maybe give choices and see what, again, they gravitate towards. And I think
Yes.
another piece that's really important is like if I have a paraprofessional that is having success with a child where the rest of us are getting that refusal or, some of those
Mhm.
behaviors, I am going to look at what that paraprofessional is doing in their interaction to see what we can glean off of that. Because we all have certain kids where it's like, I connect with them really well. And
Right.
then this paraprofessional or team member is like, I'm struggling. But then they might have a child where they got it and I'm struggling. So really leaning on each other and getting rid of your pride with that and just
Right.
kind of gleaning how we can mimic what someone else is doing.
Yeah, and that really goes to that, awareness and communication.
Hmm.
I will often find sometimes that it's not until we get into the room that the whole IEP team is like, "Oh, you're seeing that? I'm seeing that." Like, And then the parent will go like, oh, I'm seeing a little bit of that at home too. And, and it's
Yeah.
like, if we were to do this beforehand, we wouldn't have to wait until this
Right.
meeting comes and
Right.
we're talking about what we're seeing. Um, but another thing just to touch on when you talk about the behaviors
Hmm.
is that, also if you're seeing where, especially when I see a lot of dysregulation or a lot of, refusing to complete the task, finding out the function of the behavior. And
Mm.
that is where we get into potentially them conducting a FBA or functional behavior assessment. Um, and the purpose of that is to literally say, why don't they want to do this task? Why aren't they complete? And I should say want, why aren't they there? That's
Yeah.
better. Why
Yeah.
aren't they doing this task? Why aren't they starting this task or completing this task? Or why are they hiding under their desk? Or
Hmm.
why are they running out of the room? And it looks at where it's happening. And then I always tell parents just be mindful and make sure that when they're doing the FBAs, make sure that when you're looking at them, we are looking at how to support the learner and how to adjust the environment. And we're not looking at how to make them less disabled. Because we
Yeah.
have to remember a lot of our learners, like, autistic, executive functioning concerns, sensory dysregulation, sensory needs and sensitivities, like those things are not going to go away. So
Hmm.
we need to recognize, okay, we've connected that it is an executive functioning concern, and that's why they're struggling with the task initiation. Now, how can we support that? Oh, we're going to try a fidget. We're going to give them a visual schedule. We're going to allow them time to process the request. We're going to repeat instructions. You see how
Yeah.
all of that is understanding they have this executive functioning concern and then saying, how can we help them get past that barrier and what support can we use? So just always make sure, especially to my parents, I would say that have littles, make sure that, the FBA is used as a sense of finding out the barrier and implementing support and not used as a punitive measure or
Yeah.
to try and say, if we do this, they'll no longer do this. They'll no
Yeah.
longer have this way of being or thinking because that's not going to change.
Right. Like the goal of a behavior plan is not to make an autistic child act like a neurotypical child and get
Exactly.
rid of what makes them them and the
Hmm.
way that they think and the way that they learn. That's
Hmm.
such a great thought on that. Thank you. So I feel like parents are, especially being with young kids, I feel like parents are often the best source for coming up with accommodations for the classroom, but they may not know it in that language. Like if I said to a parent of a 3-year-old that's just entering my classroom, like, do you have any ideas for accommodations, or modifications? That would not fly. They'd be like, I don't know the language that you're
I know what that
speaking.
is.
But how can we learn ways a child responds best to things at home so it can be transferred to the school setting?
So I think one, a lot of times, just like I say, school staff does this all the time and parents do it all the time too. A lot of times we accommodate without knowing what an accommodation is.
Hmm.
So what you pointed out is so true because we'll be like, oh, if I, for example, I give prompts to transition my children. And so I would not have thought to bring that into the school setting. And so, for example, we do family time, and I mention this on every podcast because I'm hoping it'll like take over and every parent will do it. But we do family time. And so an hour before my kids go to bed, their tablets go up, me and dad's phones go up. And for 30 minutes, we watch a show or a movie. And we all take turns picking each night until we finish the movie or show or episode. And then the last 30 minutes are books. And so I learned that my children love this and they look forward to this,
Mm,
even if they don't want to get off their tablets. But part of it is that transition piece, right?
yeah.
So I will let them know, and my husband's also ADHD. So I will let the entire house know, hey, family time in 30 minutes, family time in 15 minutes, family time in 5 minutes. Now the school has worked with my youngest on saying, can I just have 1 more minute or 5 more minutes? So he will say, Mommy, can I just have 1 more minute or 5 more minutes? And I will give him those minutes.
Yeah.
Um, and then we transition. And so that's something that parents don't think about that they do to prepare to leave the house or to transition, that you can tell the school, hey, it works for my child when I prepare them ahead of time.
Yeah.
But that's an example of something that they can do in the school setting and the home setting. So I always tell parents, whenever a struggle comes up at the school, think about, one, do I have that struggle at home? And then two, how do I address that struggle? And then bring that to the school team and talk through what would that look like as an accommodation.
That's so well said in a way that I wouldn't have thought of explaining it. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like tapping into what obviously what the parents are already doing, but
Right.
maybe bringing up different things like um, transitions. How does it go when your child needs to stop playing with whatever or be done with the iPad and move on to something else? Like just asking some of those leading questions will probably help you get what they're naturally doing
Mhm.
and lead to things that you could use as an accommodation in the IEP.
Yeah, and a lot of times how it gets asked, if, and that's why we have to look at it as working together. A lot of times, how it comes off, sometimes it can be from the school. It's just like, well, what are you doing at home when this happens?
Yeah,
And when you're like me and think like I do, being autistic, my thought is like, well, that doesn't happen because I don't have to transition my child from, like, I'm thinking I don't have to transition him off of a work task, which is usually what they're referring to, right?
right,
It's
right.
usually, it's rarely just like a transition to, from one classroom to another. It's usually like I'm transitioning them from math to writing or from lit
Right.
to this. So as parents, sometimes we can get caught up in the specifics and be
Yeah.
like, well, I don't have to do that because like we don't do work at home.
Yeah.
And so instead of it just being like, well, what do you do with transitions? And then it's easier for the parent because we're already overwhelmed. We're in an IEP meeting. We're
Hmm.
it's a team of staff that see each other every day. We see you once a year, two, three
Yeah.
times meetings. Um, and so you can go blank. So them saying that would be like, oh, well, when I have to transition them off their tablet, like you said, I do this. Or when I have to transition them to get out the door to get to school, I do this. So it's really too, like you said, it's just about how you ask the question to really trigger that for the parent.
Yeah. Something you said in there made me think of my own experience with my son having an IEP from second grade through 12th grade. And that is, as a parent, when you're in a meeting, even if you know your kid so well, your brain goes blank sometimes or turns to mush, and you can't even like find a good way to explain what you're trying to talk about. And I think that leads to why I was so impressed talking to you before this episode about what you do as an advocate, because I think most people think hear advocate and they think, oh my gosh, like adversarial. That's my last question
Right.
for you, is kind of talking about that.
Uh-huh.
But seeing it as someone who can help when the parent's brain goes blank or goes to mush, and because you're just so emotionally involved with your child and you want school to be going well. And when it's not, oh, it's so hard. Like it can, my experience as a parent, it can make you cry through an entire meeting. And then,
Right.
they keep having the meeting anyway, and you're like not
Right.
contributing. Okay, so, or they bring a principal and have them sit in the corner of the room, not even at the table, right? Been
Yeah,
there. So
that's wild.
it is wild. It was wild. And I did cry through the whole thing. So when a parent brings in an advocate like you to be involved in IEP meetings, what are like two things that educators could do to collaborate with you and not see you or an advocate as an adversarial?
So I think one is understand that we all want what's best for the child.
Yeah.
That is my big thing. I have rarely sat at IEP tables where I have felt like the educator just does not, and I said rarely because it does
Yeah.
happen, where I have felt like the educator just does not want what is best for the child. I think a lot of times there's just a limited education, and a lot of educators admit this, on disabilities. They
Hmm.
do a lot of professional development on disabilities. My mother and my sister are both educators, and my mother is an early childhood educator.
Oh,
And that's something she has expressed since, myself and my son's diagnosis, is that like I don't get training on autistic children.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't get in-depth training. Like you get your base level training, but she's
Yeah.
like, I don't get that full training of like the things you've mentioned about supporting them. I don't get that. So understand we all want what's best for the child. And the second one is just to be responsive to feedback and open to questions. I come in and I kind of look at, okay, who's giving input, who's talking, who's providing information. I had one IEP meeting where the individual running the meeting was just like, holding court. Not that person, but just like answering everything, responding to everything. And I finally said, like Miss Such and Such, you are the general education teacher that this child is in the classroom with. What are you seeing? And her face like lit up. And she's like,
Mhm.
I'm seeing this and I'm seeing that and I'm seeing this and I'm seeing that. And, I've had meetings where we're trying to rewrite a goal and we're looking at, prompting and, task initiation completion and all these things. So as the special education teacher, I said, hey, what does the prompting look like? What are you? And she's like, oh, well, so they don't need prompts for initiation. It's just completion. And, what does the prompting look like? And she's telling us like, it's not so much as like her having to like be right there the whole time. She just really can say their name and then they do the task. So those are things that are so important. And sometimes you need a kind of neutral party, like you were mentioning before we talk, before we got on the
Mhm.
podcast, who I'm there for the parent, but they hired me to help their voice being heard and to support their child. And so
Yeah.
I want to know everyone's input, good, bad, or ugly, because that gives us an idea of how we're supporting the child. And so I think keeping in mind that when a parent brings in an advocate, and like this is one of the biggest things, when a parent brings in an advocate, they're feeling unheard. But that doesn't mean they're feeling unheard by the educator. You have to remember you're not the only one on the team, and you shouldn't be the only one doing all the work. And so a parent can be feeling unheard by administration. They could be feeling unheard by a related service provider, but they're feeling unheard in some way that they feel like I need to bring in this individual who can make sure my voice is heard.
Yeah. That's so good on so many levels because, when you go into it thinking adversarial, I think right there you stop the progress from happening. So if we can kind of, like we do with anything, strategies, new ideas, things like the neurodiversity movement, keep an
Mhm.
open mind and be willing to listen. And I think that's going to bring everything down like 10 notches. And
Yes.
I have to say, the learning more about the work that you do today, I want to say thank you because it's such important work that I don't think it's talked about enough. So, can you share the different services you offer for families?
Yes, so I do evaluation results reviews. So that's often for families if they've just had an evaluation done and the school is getting ready to determine eligibility, or I've had parents who their child's on a 504 and they are trying to determine if they're eligible for an IEP. And so my background is psychology, and so all of my education's in psychology and assessments. And so, I have the ability to look through and really dissect that and talk them through what that is pointing towards. Then I offer IEP reviews. And so it's just a one-time review. I review the evaluation results and the IEP to make sure they're in line with what's being discussed. I address the parent concern, see if there's anything we should add to it. And then I can either help the parent draft a letter to the school with those concerns or just identify things they need to talk about at the IEP meeting. And then lastly, I have an advocacy and consultation package. And that's where I can either ghostwrite your letters for you. So I do that for a lot of educators and school staff that work in the district their children go to.
Ooh, okay.
Yes.
So
And
that I was
they,
telling Destiny earlier that that horrible meeting that I had was when my son was in middle school and we were at the table ready to meet and then the principal walked in and sat in the corner away from us and it, I could have used someone like you for that and for also like the ghostwriting, that kind of stuff. Because it's a really tricky place when you have a child that you are trying to advocate for their needs and what you know about them, but you work for the district.
yes. And
Ugh,
so
yeah.
I will have educators that hire me for that, where they're just like,
Okay.
I need someone to insert the law and things like that. And then I also attend IEP meetings. So that's the other one where I do everything I just mentioned, look at the evaluation results, the IEPs, I draft the letters, but I also virtually attend the IEP meeting.
Awesome. Awesome. Where can everybody find you?
Yeah, so my website is Destiny Huff Consulting, and my Facebook is Destiny Huff Consulting. And then my Instagram is Destiny Huff underscore IEP underscore advocate. So
All right. Well, I'm going to have all the links to all of the places people can find you because I think some parents might be interested. And you have been just amazing to talk to, and I've actually learned so much talking to you. Thank you so much for being here, Destiny.
yes, thank you for having me. And when you guys reach out, I do have a free consultation.
Ooh,
So I always do that because I always think it's important to make sure, that I'm a fit for you as an advocate, but you're also a fit for me as a client, and that I'm the best one to serve you. So I do have a 30-minute free consultation where we can kind of strategize and see if I would benefit you or if I can refer you to someone who can.
yeah, that's amazing. All
Mhm.
right. Well, I know we'll be talking soon. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.